Hello, everyone, and welcome to Ancient Nubia, Art and Insight. My name's Deborah Cunningham, and I'm the Senior Program Director here at Primary Source. For those of you who are new to our organization, we're a nonprofit started by teachers, for teachers, with a specific goal of bringing the wider world to students in ways that are engaging and approachable. Most of what we offer are professional development programs, curricula, resources to globalize your school are all on view in the For Teachers section of our website at www.primarysource.org. This is in fact where a recording of our session together today will be housed for future access. So we encourage you to share it with your colleagues and interested art lovers, fellow teachers. They'll be able to enjoy it at any point. And this is what the locale it will live in looks like. This is the arts page of our archived primary source webinars and videos. So feel free to check that out in the For Teachers part of our website. You can also look at previous webinars that we've done on all manner of topics. For the present, though, I'm so pleased to have all of you with us live this afternoon, wherever you may be in the Boston area or beyond. Each year, Primary Source offers online seminars that help teachers to build their knowledge and store of resources on global topics. For me, it's always such a thrill when we can offer a program on the arts, since visual art is a medium I think is particularly well suited to online learning. I was delighted when the MFA, in the person of Emily Scheinberg, who is the head of school programs and teacher resources, approached us about collaborating on a program on ancient Nubia that would coincide with the launch of the major new Ancient Nubia Now exhibition at the MFA Boston. This online seminar today is the result of that conversation, and we feel fortunate that you've chosen to join us to hear from and interact with the curator of this stunning exhibition, Dr. Denise Doxey. Denise Doxey is curator of ancient Egyptian, Nubian, and Near Eastern art at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. Her interests and expertise include various aspects of the art, archaeology, and civilizations of ancient Nubia and Egypt. Before Denise joined the staff of the MFA, she was keeper of the Egyptian section of the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology. She has excavated in Greece and in Egypt and has taught Egyptology courses at the University of Pennsylvania and at Harvard. She wrote the book Arts of Ancient Nubia, the beautiful volume corresponding to the current exhibition, and she co-authored Jewels of Ancient Nubia in conjunction with the MFA's Gold and the Gods exhibit. I love these titles. Denise, we're grateful for this chance to see the Ancient Nubia Now exhibit through your eyes and to discover the wonders of the MFA's world-class Nubian art collection with you. So while we shift over to Denise's slides, I'd like to remind everyone that you are all invited and encouraged to post comments and questions in the chat box at the bottom right of the screen, which enlarges when you click the arrow. And we'll address most of these right after Denise's presentation. Welcome, Denise.
Thank you so much, Deborah. And I'm delighted to be here today, and I thank you all for coming to listen. The Museum of Fine Arts in Boston has the largest collection of ancient Nubian art outside of Sudan. And we have about 25,000 objects, many of them tiny fragmentary pieces, but nevertheless. The reason we have this one, okay, I'm being stupid, sorry. The reason we have this wonderful collection is largely because between 1913 and 1932, the Harvard University Boston Museum of Fine Arts expedition, led by George Andrew Reisner, excavated at a number of sites in what is now Sudan, including the royal cemeteries of the three great kingdoms that we're going to be talking about today. Reisner was a brilliant archaeologist ahead of his time. making use of all sorts of new technologies, notably photography. But he was not so much ahead of his time as a person. He had this sort of cultural and racial prejudices that were all too common to people who were born in the 1860s. So occasionally that colored his judgment in a way that led him to misinterpret things. And we'll see at least one example of that as we go along. To put Nubia on the map for you, we are talking about the area along the Nile Valley from roughly Aswan in southern Egypt in the north to Khartoum in the south. And as you can see, this directly borders Egypt, and it's almost impossible to discuss ancient Nubia without also mentioning ancient Egypt, because the two were neighbors for thousands of years. Sometimes they were friends, sometimes they were enemies, sometimes they fought, sometimes they traded, and the border was constantly in flux between the two, with one taking advantage of a weakness on the part of the other and vice versa. This part of the Nile Valley, unlike Egypt, which has a very wide, fertile floodplain and is good for agriculture, the Nile in Nubia has much steeper, less agriculturally sound valley. So agriculture, unlike Egypt, was never the principal economic driver of ancient Nubia. Instead, they took advantage of natural resources and their proximity to important trade routes that went all throughout northern and central Africa, as well as to the Red Sea, which came to the Nile and allowed them to export objects up into Egypt and the Mediterranean. By far the most important of the resources found in Nubia is gold. And here we see a group of Nubians coming to visit the court of King Tutankhamun. And that man in the center who is holding what looks like a tray of donuts, those are actually gold ingots. And as you can also see in this image, other objects that came from further in Africa that were exotic objects desired by Egypt were things like animal skins, ostrich feathers, ostrich eggs, and so forth. So as I mentioned, we're going to talk about three of the great kingdoms that we find in ancient Nubia at three different sites. The Kerma period, which is based on the name of a town that is a modern town near the Third Cataract, which flourished from about 2400 to about 1550 BCE. Then from about 750 to 332 BCE, we'll focus on the kingdom of Napata. And from about 332 BCE to about 364 CE, farther south on the Nile at Meroitic. These sites do not, however, span the entire history of ancient Nubia, which goes back much, much further than that, 6,000 years ago. And we have in the collection, although I will not be talking about them at any length, material that goes back to the Neolithic period, when the Nubians were very much on the forefront of civilization this far back. We also have from the northern part of Egypt two cultures called the A group, which goes back to about 3100 or 3000 BCE, and the C group, there is no B group, which roughly corresponds to the time period that we'll be discussing in Kerma. But we're not discussing these in part because it just would be too much to cover, and because these are not the great strengths of our own collection. During the C group period, the Nubians and the Egyptians were actively engaged in trade and interconnection. And we know that there were Nubians living in Egypt and serving in the Egyptian military. And this is a funerary stele of one such person, a man by the name of Nenu. And he lived in Egypt. He married an Egyptian woman. And here we see him holding his arrow and his quiver. And he's identified in the text as a Nubian. And his clothing is Nubian style clothing. His wife, on the other hand, is dressed like an Egyptian. And his two children, one boy and one girl, are also dressed as Nubians. And he lived and died in Egypt, was buried in an Egyptian style tomb with this Egyptian style funerary monument. So you can see that this there isn't a clear cut division between Egyptians and Nubians. There's a lot of interaction and entanglement. Beginning around 1975 BCE, the Egyptians took over the northern part of Nubia. And they didn't actually colonize it. They simply sent military outposts, and they built these massive mud brick fortresses all along the Nile on both sides of the river, practically within sight of each other. In some cases, they are within sight of each other. And because the Sea Group had been a relatively peaceful, friendly neighbor, one wonders exactly why they would suddenly build this huge uh, agglomeration of fortresses. But the principal reason, or one of the principal reasons, is that it gave them access to gold. If you notice the sort of dotted line that heads out from the site of Kuban at the top of the slide, that is the Wadi Alaki, which is one of the principal gold producing regions. And in this way, the Egyptians could get the gold they wanted without having to go through the Nubian middlemen. And we have one of the objects that survived from one of these fortresses, the fort of Kerma, are these weights. They're stone weights that were used for keeping track of the amount of gold that was coming into the fortresses. So that symbol that you see is the Egyptian hieroglyphic symbol for gold, and then a number of slash lines indicating the quantity of gold to which this weight corresponded. Another reason for building these fortresses was that although the Sea Group was a friendly neighbor, there was a new kingdom emerging farther south near the third cataract of the Nile at the site of Kerma. Kerma is the modern name of the site. We don't know the ancient name. Kerma was a big fortified city. It had suburbs and ports and industrial areas outside the city walls. And you see a picture at the top here of the city of Kerma, and at the bottom, a picture of the cemetery adjacent to Kerma, which is where the MFA excavations took part. We didn't really work much in the city. Here you can see one of these royal tombs at the time of the excavations in 1913 and what it looks like today, or just a couple of years ago. The kings were buried in these massive mounded tumuli with mud brick supports, and then they were filled in after the king's death. And this is a truly massive tomb. The diameter is roughly the same length as a football field. And the building you see in the background was a mortuary temple that was built to honor the king in perpetuity. Well, the temple today looks like a sort of a monochromatic mud brick blob. In antiquity, it was actually decorated with brightly colored tiles, including these faience pieces. This lion, which is about 3 feet long to give you a sense of size, is one of 2 lions that flanked the entrance into this mortuary temple. Faience is a ceramic material that's based on silica, which is basically sand, which they had in abundance, and it's combined with other ingredients, including copper ore or copper itself. And this copper ore, when fired at a high temperature, turns into this beautiful, bright, shiny blue surface. We don't know what these lions symbolize, whether or not they're gods or not. But lions and powerful animals are one of the images that we see again and again and again at Kerma. And interestingly enough, we don't have preserved any representations in 3 dimensions of human gods or of kings or queens. Whether this was taboo or just not popular is not clear. And one of the reasons it's not clear is that we have no written records that survive from ancient Kerma. So all that we know about Kerma is based on the archaeology, primarily, or on what the Egyptians tell us about people of Kerma. And being that they were rivals and ultimately enemies, the Egyptians described the Nubians in very unflattering terms. They're always cowardly, they're wretched, they're vile, they're craven-hearted. So we don't get an exactly fair image of Nubia from the Egyptian perspective. These 2 sculptures here are made in a technique that is unique to Kerma. We saw that lion just a second ago that was made of faience. If you use basically the same ingredients to make a thinner paste, you can coat the outsides of statues and then fire them. So these are made of quartzite originally, the ram has lost most of its glaze, but the technique, it must signify that the color blue meant something to them, because the quartzite is a lovely stone on its own. So there really is no reason to turn it blue unless the blue has some significance. But again, in the absence of writing, we don't know.
Denise, just to interject for one quick second, do you see that little window for Logitech that popped up on your screen? Can you see
Yes.
that? Yeah, can you click close on that?
Oops, where did it go? Now I can't find it. Oh,
You
here we
might
go.
have to move, there you go. And
There it goes.
great, perfect. That
Okay.
way we can see the whole ram. Thanks.
Okay. Now, animals like rams also appear in ancient Nubian pottery of the Kerma period, as in this basket-shaped vessel in the center of the screen that has a ram's-headed spout. And particularly characteristic, the pottery of Kerma is really breathtaking in person. Particularly these blacktop redware beakers, the tulip-shaped beakers, which are ubiquitous. They're found in the tombs stacked in large numbers. They were probably used as part of the funerary feast. And they have a very almost metallic, shiny interior and extremely, extremely thin, finely made walls. They're extremely lightweight and delicate. Unlike the Egyptians, who were buried at this time mummified and lying stretched out inside coffins, the people of Kerma were buried curled up on their sides in fetal position. And most people were buried wrapped in cattle hides. But the very elite members of society, the king and members of the royal family and so on, were buried on these ebony beds that have legs in the form of cattle, and the head would be on a headrest at the higher end of the bed, and the footrests are decorated with ivory inlays of rows of animals. None of the beds have survived, although many legs and headrests have survived. But this is a reproduction made in 1940 based on one of the beds that we excavated. What we do have are the ivory inlays that decorated the footboards. These are made of hippopotamus ivory, so basically hippopotamus teeth. And they come in the form of a wide range of different kinds of animals and plants, including, and this is quite typical, from the same bed, a a combination of animals that you might actually see in Africa at this time, like this gazelle and hyena on either side, but then also these fantastic mythical creatures, like the goddess that you see in the middle, who is a hippopotamus goddess with a lion's mane. It looks sort of like a Plains Indian headdress, but it's not. And she is a protective goddess that we know from Egyptian sources named Taweret, who she's brandishing this knife to protect the sleeper, or in this case, the deceased person. Also, absolutely characteristic of Kerma is we've seen this blue glaze already, but the same kind of a glaze was used to glaze either quartz crystal beads or quartz crystal in their natural form that were turned into amulets. And you can see this wonderful translucent blue finish. In the case of the beads, the round beads, it's a very difficult technique because you have to drill a hole in a quartz crystal pebble and then glaze it and fire it and hit that perfect temperature where it's hot enough to fuse the glaze but not hot enough to cause the crystal to explode. So it's a very difficult technique, but they mastered it and they produced these things by the thousands. Some of the jewelry from Kerma incorporates Egyptian imports. So the string of beads on the left, for example, which is a bit earlier when peaceful trade was going on with Egypt, they've taken an Egyptian scarab and placed it in a gold setting and strung it with beads of carnelian and amethyst. The necklace on the right, which is a little bit later in date, comes from the period at which Kerma was actually threatening Egypt and sending military expeditions into the southern part of Egypt and bringing things back with them. And this silver amulet in the center is a type of amulet that was worn in Egypt by women, and it was a fertility amulet. it's been taken back to Kerma and strung with those translucent glazed quartz beads and carnelian beads, a popular color scheme in Kerma. But in this case, it was owned by a man who probably brought it back from one of these military excursions into Egypt and wore it, certainly not as a fertility amulet, but simply as a high status reminder of his success in Egypt. And right in the middle of that big tumulus that I showed you earlier, amongst all these other very non-Egyptian types of objects that we have just been looking at, the expedition uncovered this statue of a woman named Senaway, along with one of her husbands. His was only preserved from the waist down, and a number of other broken Egyptian statues. This one happens to be intact. And this really confused George Reisner, because coming in, having read from the Egyptian perspective how vile and wretched and pathetic the people of Kerma were, he and his own racial biases completely misinterpreted the site based on these Egyptian objects. Because Lady Senaway and her husband are known quantities to Egyptologists, and they were in that day because they have the biggest tomb from the period known as the Middle Kingdom that survives aside from the royal tombs. So he hypothesized that this was an Egyptian outpost and that Lady Senaway's husband was the governor. In fact, he was completely backwards because the statue was already almost 400 years old when it was placed in this tomb. The king of Kerma, obviously, during one of these during one of these military expeditions, arranged to have the statue brought back to Kerma, where he buried it in his tomb. And this is no small feat because this statue is over life size. It weighs about 2,000 pounds. And it had to be transported at a minimum, we're not 100% certain where it originated, it had to be transported a minimum of 400 miles from Egypt to Kerma. So this man obviously had a lot of clout and like conspicuous consumption, and that he did all of this just to bury it in his tomb. But it's perhaps less surprising when you consider that also buried in the tomb, in the same corridor with the statue, were the bodies of hundreds, over 300 people who either were killed or killed themselves to accompany the king into the afterlife. So this was a person who had a lot of influence, a lot of clout, and was willing to show it. Ultimately, the kingdom of Kerma, after a series of 3 or 4 generations of intermittent warfare with Egypt, allied themselves with a group called the Hyksos, who were a Syro-Palestinian people who had occupied the northern part of Egypt with a plan to squeeze Egypt from both directions. And unfortunately for Kerma, this ultimately backfired. And under King Thutmose I, about 1550 BC, the Egyptians succeeded in defeating Kerma and taking over all of its territory. They reopened the Middle Kingdom fortresses, they built Egyptian-style temples in Nubia, and they expanded their reach far beyond where it had been in the previous Middle Kingdom. And they ruled Nubia for almost 500 years. And during this time, as you can imagine, there was a great deal of interconnection, intermarriage, cultural exchange going in both directions. And here we have a relief of King Thutmose III, under whom Egypt reached the greatest extent of its power, going all the way from Nubia up to Mesopotamia. And here we see Thutmose. This is a temple that was set up inside one of the fortresses, and he's worshiping the ram-headed god Khnum. And Khnum is identified as the one who oppresses the archers. So as we saw earlier with the Nubian archer and his Egyptian wife, the Nubians are still being identified as archers. And this very much personifies or exemplifies the official royal Egyptian attitude toward the Nubians as being oppressed and defeated. We know, in fact, that there was a much more nuanced relationship and cultural intertanglements where people at these forts were intermarrying with Egyptians and being buried in the same tombs with people who were buried in Nubian fashion rather than Egyptian. This is Amenhotep III, a little bit later than Thutmose III, and he was the most prolific of the Egyptian kings building temples in Nubia. He built a number of them. And I just want to notice the pose and the clothing of this statue, because we'll be seeing the ancestors of this type of statue in just a little bit. A couple of the temples where Amenhotep III built, one at Soleb in the northern part of Nubia and at Jebel Barkal right in the center of Nubia. And Jebel Barkal is one of the sites that was excavated by the Harvard MFA expedition. And at the foot of this mountain is a very ancient sacred site in Nubia because there's this massive stone mountain that just emerges from the desert. You can see it for miles around. And it makes sense that it would be a sacred place. But Amenhotep built a temple at the base of this, or added to an existing temple at the base of this mountain. And he also built temples to, or in honor of his wife, Queen T. And here we see her as the head of a small statue of the queen, and the queen in this amulet known as a menat, which shows her in the form of the goddess Hathor. And her facial features and wig are very characteristic of representations of Queen T. And the Hathor representation on the menat, you will see that Hathor appears both in the form of a woman and in the form of a cow. And Hathor would go on to become one of the Egyptian gods that were welcomed into the Nubian pantheon in later times. And we will see Hathor again and again as we move forward through Kerma, or through Nubia. Now, about 1000 BC or thereabouts, the Egyptians pulled out of Nubia. Egypt itself was contracting as a world power, and they could no longer manage to maintain control of Nubia, so they left. And right around the site of Jebel Barkal, the site where the Egyptian temple of the god Amun-Ra had been located, a new kingdom emerged in filling the void left by the Egyptians. And this became the capital of a vast empire, the most extensive of all of the empires that would emerge in ancient Nubia. So I'm going to back up one slide. What happened is that the Egyptians built this temple to Amun-Ra, their supreme god. The Nubians adopted Amun as their own supreme god, in part because he takes the form of a ram, which probably resonated with their earlier ram gods. And the priesthood of this temple of Amun-Ra at Jebel Barkal, or at Napata, were extremely close with the priests of Amun at Thebes, the famous temple of Karnak. And when Egypt began having difficulties with rival kings claiming the throne, the priests of Thebes turned not to the other Egyptian rulers, but to their counterparts in Napata. And under a king by the name of Pianki in the second half of the 8th century BCE, he came to the aid of Thebes and succeeded in defeating all of Egypt, right up to the Mediterranean. Pianki and the members of his royal family and his 4 successors were considered by the Egyptians to be perfectly valid rulers, and they became Dynasty 25. They ruled in part from Egypt, but they returned home to Napata to be buried. And Pianki himself and the other kings who ruled as Dynasty 25, with one exception, are buried at a site called El Kuru. They were buried in pyramids with multiple burial chambers underneath. Nothing survives of the pyramids. They were completely stripped for their stone by later builders. But if you enter the burial chambers, some of them still have beautifully preserved painted decoration. And this is the burial chamber of the last king of the 25th dynasty, King Tengwatamani. Some of the finest objects in our collection and in our exhibition are objects found in the tombs of Pianki's queens and other royal women. He had several wives, and the jewelry that was found in their tombs is just spectacular. These 2 pieces, some people argue, are made in Egypt and were brought back as booty by Pianki. I don't know if I agree with that, but we have, for example, a gilded silver ram-headed sphinx that's Amun-Ra in the form of a sphinx. And he is sitting on top of a column that is decorated with cloisonné enamel in lapis lazuli and glass. And the object on the right is one of the real superstars of our collection. This is a pendant, a cylindrical amulet case, which is embedded in a rock crystal sphere and topped by the head of Hathor, with whom we are now familiar. And what makes this particularly remarkable is that the head of Hathor, which appears to be cast gold, is actually not solid, it's hollow. And it's made of separate pieces of gold that have been soldered together. And the solder is absolutely invisible, even when this object is greatly enlarged. And the fact that they were able to do this without melting the original gold elements that make up this piece is really mind-boggling, especially when you consider that it's actually smaller than 2 inches tall. Another amulet from one of the wives of Quick King Pianki is this amulet. We have Hathor yet again, in this case nursing a queen. And in Egypt, we see representations of Hathor nursing kings, and symbolically giving him this divine nourishment. But it's unusual to see a queen in this context, and this is one of many items that suggest that queens held a particularly important place in ancient Nubia, more so than in Egypt. And another thing to point out here is that this is again an amulet that's only about 2 inches tall, but that if you look at the goddess Hathor, she is built sort of like Lady Senui was, very, very tall, very thin, sort of Barbie doll. While the Nubian queen is a lot more voluptuous, curvier, and this is an indication, quite an early indication of what the Nubian ideal of feminine beauty was like, very different from that of the Egyptians. And you'll see that even more prominently in this next slide, where we have two goddesses. We don't know which goddesses, but one with a human head, one with the head of a lioness. And they're both shown nude. They're very much this ideal Nubian feminine beauty. They are also winged, and we will notice going forward that many of these deities, whether we can identify them or not, do have wings, and that seems to be a rather common thread in the Nubian religion. This beautiful little vessel is one of my favorites. It was meant to hold a valuable commodity such as an unguent or a perfume. And the design is very clever because it takes the form of this bound animal, this oryx, but with the upturned neck and open mouth. If you put a cork in the mouth, the bound legs form a nice base, and the upturned neck keeps it from leaking. But if you actually want to pick it up and apply some of this ointment, the handle makes the legs make a nice little handle. So it's just, I think it's a very clever design and very endearing object. Another winged deity appears on this very contemporary looking collar, which comes from the tomb of the wife of Pianki's successor, Shabitka. And this is a sheet metal collar in two pieces. And where it's hinged, there's a pin that pulls out from the label that we put around your neck. And in this case, we have a male winged god, a solar god with a sun disk on his head. And edging that is formed with notched wire. And the wire work from ancient Nubia really amazes me, because if you think about having to create wire from a sheet of gold and roll it out to this fine wire, we'll see some fantastic wire work again as we move ahead. In addition to the royal family, the cemetery at El Kuru contained a cemetery for horses. Pianki and three of his four successors, the four that were buried at the site of El Kuru, each buried one or two teams of horses. There are a total of 24 horse tombs. The horses were buried standing up, and around their necks they wore rather elaborate horse jewelry. Not functional tack at all, it's purely jewelry. Some of the same types of amulets we find in human burials. So to give you an idea, some of them, these necklaces were found, or they had fallen from around the neck of the horses belonging to Shabitka, whose wife's collar we were just looking at. The site of Jebel Barkal, as I mentioned, went on to be the sanctuary of Amun-Ra, who is now the lead god in the Nubian pantheon. And they went on to build a series of temples on top of the earlier Egyptian temples. And here you see one of them during the excavation, looking down from the top of the cliff above it. And this is only about half of it. In fact, this temple goes on and on much further. And in this temple was found this little statuette of King Taharka. Taharka was the king during the time when the Nubian Empire, the Napata Empire, reached its greatest extent. And he actually became a rival of the Assyrians, fighting on behalf of allies in what is now Israel. And this is a small statue, not terribly well preserved, but it gives us a good idea of what the royal regalia of the Napatan kings looked like. So in addition to this rather Egyptian-looking kilt, not unlike the one you saw on Amenhotep III from hundreds of years earlier, they wear this close-fitting cap with two protective cobras on the brow. In Egypt, you would typically see one. And around their necks, they wear this very distinctive necklace, which is made up of a central representation of a ram's head symbolizing Amun-Ra. And it swings around the back of your neck, and then at each end in the front is a smaller representation of Amun-Ra, which is not very visible here. Just outside the temples, the excavators found a cache of statues in varying sizes, some of them colossal, that had been deliberately broken apart in antiquity. Exactly how and why remains a subject of some debate, but they were ritually buried afterwards, and they were able to be reassembled to a certain extent. And we have 3 of them in our collection. The statue that you see on the left of King Senkamaniskin is a little bit below life size, but the statues of his 2 sons and successors on Lamani on the far right and Espelta in the center are colossal. They're over 13 feet tall. And keep these characters in mind. We will be talking a little bit more about Espelta and Senkamaniskin shortly. Under King Taharka, whose statue we just saw, the royal cemetery moved across the river to the site of Nuri, still within sight of Jebel Barkal. And here the pyramids, as you can see, are much better preserved. Many of them are quite well preserved. And all of the rest of the kings of the Napatan period were buried in this cemetery. From the tomb of King Taharka, we have this selection of Shwabti figurines. And Shwabtis have their origins in Egypt, where they served as servants for the deceased in the afterlife. So the inscription that is carved on them is a text from the Book of the Dead, in which they are asked to answer when the deceased is called upon to do agricultural chores. And that's why most of them are carrying a pair of hoes in their hands. When the Nubian kings took over Egypt, they really almost sought out to out-Egyptian the Egyptians on everything. They saw themselves as the true descendants of Amun, where an Egyptian king might have 300 Shwabtis. In this period, not very impressive Shwabtis, Taharka had more than 1,000 of them. And they're all carved in stone, very different types of stone, each one like a little sculpture in itself. And they vary in size from about maybe 10 inches to about 24 inches. Now, some of them are really quite large and impressive. And he had more than 1,000 of these in his tomb. So he must have had quite a team of sculptors working on these. It's thought that though the Egyptian Shwabtis served as servants, and the text on the Nubian Shwabtis would suggest that they also served as servants, that they may actually have been believed in this period to serve a protective function. And the reason for that is that the way they were found, they were very deliberately placed up against the walls of the tomb chamber surrounding the royal sarcophagus. And these are the Shwabtis that belong to Senkamaniskin, whose statue we just saw. Espelta, the statue, the black one in the center of the earlier slide, and his brother, Al-Lamani, had massive sarcophagi made of granite gneiss and inscribed inside and out with texts involving their journey to the afterlife. The older brother, Al-Lamani, had a huge one, and the younger brother, Espelta, had an even more huge one. This one weighs, including its lid, about 16 tons. And it's not currently on view and hasn't been for some time, because there are very few places in the museum that will actually support the weight. So that's an interesting challenge for any plans for future galleries. Also in the tomb of Espelta, we have something unusual. All of these tombs were robbed in antiquity. Most of them were robbed of all of the precious metals. But in the case of King Espelta, a piece of his ceiling had fallen in, and consequently the grave robbers missed what was hidden under it. And this is just a small fraction of the treasure that was found in Espelta's tomb, which gives us just a glimpse of what must have been in these tombs when they were originally, when the kings were originally buried. And the workmanship of some of these is really remarkable. We had a metal working teacher from the museum school come over and look at that gold pitcher in the center of this image. And aside from the handle, which is made separately, this is made out of one sheet of gold. It's not soldered from different pieces. So she was amazed at how they were able to do this. Another really remarkable object from this group is, well, you see it here, this stone vessel next to the pitcher. And that is it's quite a common shape for this time period in Egypt and Nubia, called an alabastron. But this one is unique in having been adorned with this elaborate collar at the top. And you can see where the king's names have been inscribed in the top of the alabastron. And then this collar has been added, and it's made of gilded silver and decorated with cloisonné enamel with gold wiring and blue enamel filling, which most of the filling is missing. And then around the top, these extremely tiny, fine, delicate braided chains are holding a series of suspended pendants. And for the most part, they alternate between the orange carnelian and the sort of turquoise colored amazonite. But right above the king's name, there's sort of a grapefruit colored bead. And that is made of magnetite. And magnetite is a meteoric stone, so it literally falls from the sky. And whether the Nubians knew that or not, or whether they just prized it as a particularly rare and unusual kind of stone, they obviously recognized that it was important because they centered it right above the king's name. Another winged goddess, in this case, the goddess Isis, another goddess who was adopted from Egypt, and this one comes from the slightly later tomb of King Amenemhotep Lebte. And the holes and the little tabs around the outside are there because it was meant to be sewn onto his mummy wrappings. The mummies, none of the mummies have actually survived, but this beautiful pectoral shows Isis with her outstretched arms protecting the king. It would have been placed right on his chest, and it's made in the repoussé technique, in which the raised relief decoration is impressed from the outside, from the back, and then all of the details of her feathers and her bead net dress are added from the front. And she is holding in her hands two Egyptian hieroglyphs. The one on our right is the hieroglyph. It's a square rigged ship's mast, and it's the hieroglyph for breath or wind. And in the other hand, she holds the hieroglyph for life, the Ankh. So she is offering the king the breath of life in the afterlife. The final section of our today's talk revolves around the site of Meroe, which is farther south between the fifth and sixth cataracts. And Meroe was located in a region that is actually quite fertile. So there's decent agricultural land here, but they also went to great measures to artificially create these waterworks that would help to preserve water from the rainy season throughout the year. And Meroe itself was the capital of again, a huge trading network. Egypt, by this point, was no longer in control of the Nubians and hadn't been since partway through the Napatan period. But Egypt at this point was taken over first by the Greeks and later by the Romans. So Egypt has sort of ceased to exist as an independent entity at this point. But the Romans under Augustus, when they tried to conquer Meroe, couldn't. So they became trading partners. And because of this, we have a lot more interaction with the Mediterranean as well as with a broad spectrum of northern and central Africa. So we have a large cosmopolitan city with temples and workshops, ironworks. We did not excavate there, so our collection is primarily from the royal cemeteries, which we see a picture on the bottom during the excavations. Jebel Barkal, the great temple of Amen, continued to be a religious center for the Meroitic kingdom, even though by this point, by about the 4th century BCE, the capital and the royal necropolis had moved down to Meroe. And here from the temple of Jebel Barkal is a very important monument, a stele set up by a king named Tandjidamani in honor of a military victory that he had won over an enemy. And if you look very carefully, you can see that he is standing on the body of this poor fallen enemy who's lying face down under his feet. This is the longest preserved monument in the Meroitic script, in the Meroitic language. And as I mentioned earlier, during the Kerma period, we have no written records. And then during the Napatan period, the kings left texts in the ancient Egyptian language and the ancient Egyptian script, which is legible, and therefore we know about their names, their exploits, their activities and beliefs. In the Napatan period, in the Meroitic period, they are writing in their own native script and their own native language, which unfortunately has not yet been translated. I would love to tell you exactly what the stela says, but I can't. Enough research has been done that scholars can identify the sounds of the symbols, can read the names of kings, some place names, some proper nouns. So we know enough about the stele to say that Tandjidamani is making offerings to Amun-Ra at Jebel Barkal in thanks for a military victory. But other than that, the verbal system has not been worked out, so exactly what happened remains a mystery. Jebel Barkal at this time had quite a lot of military and martial sort of emphasis. So we suspect that the Meroitic Empire was at war with some of its neighbors. We don't know exactly who. But here we have preserved a quiver, which is since 2,000 years earlier, the people of Nubia were known as archers. And here we have an actual quiver that was found with its arrows in it. And we also have a series of these bronze plaques in the form of bound prisoners who are bound in this incredibly uncomfortably looking position with their arms and legs hogtied behind their backs. They have unique, distinct facial features and types of headgear. So they obviously represent different types of people, but we don't know exactly who. And these were nailed to giant tree trunk sized flagpoles at Meroe. So in the act of mounting them on these flagpoles, you're ritualistically driving a stake right through the torso of this fallen enemy. The cemeteries at Meroe were the primary focus of Reisner's work for the Harvard MFA expedition. And so we have a large collection of material primarily from the cemeteries. Pottery, this pot actually comes from a cemetery at Kerma out of the Meroitic period, about the 2nd century CE. And pottery of this period is very lively. It incorporates local motifs, motifs borrowed from the Mediterranean world, such as the grapevines you see here. The crocodiles are very much a local motif. We had someone in the exhibition recently called this the crock pot, which I thought was kind of fun. But we have a series of crocodiles going around the shoulder of the vessel, biting each other's tails. And then beneath them, this grapevine motif. And wine was one of the principal exports into Nubia from the Mediterranean world and from Egypt, in which they continued to exchange things like these luxury goods, but also ultimately things like elephants for the Roman war effort. Their jewelry is magnificent and technically extremely advanced. The people of Meroe mastered at least 7 different types of enameling, some of which were later lost until medieval European times. So here we see Hathor again, surrounded by multicolored enamel in this bracelet. Glass was being used extensively. And these two necklaces surprised me because these look like they could have been made yesterday, and yet they were made almost 2,000 years ago. We again have really superb wire work. This bracelet, and I show you with detail so that you can see how carefully braided the wire is. This bracelet is only about 1/4 of an inch thick. So it gives you an idea of just how finely detailed this work is with the granulation and, and wire work. We have a wide variety of different earring types from Meroitic, including some that you see here. The one on the right has enamel in the floral pendant at the top and granulation on the pendant beads at the bottom. The wide variety of these ear studs, many of which were filled with multicolored enamel, such as the one you see on the left. The one on the right features an image of a kneeling winged goddess wearing a very elaborate headdress. And again, here you can see the body type favored by the Nubians. Rings were very popular, particularly signet rings like these, which are decorated on the bezels with religious motifs. And these were sometimes found worn in multiple, so not only multiple rings on one hand, but even on one finger. I mentioned that Egypt at this time was under Greek and then Roman control, and a very active trade with the Mediterranean was visible. We know that classical authors and diplomats from the Roman Empire visited Meroe and wrote about it. And from the tombs at Meroe, we have this beautiful bronze head of Dionysus. This is one of two that were found in the same tomb. And Dionysus' cult probably came to Meroe along with the wine that was such an important import because he is the Greek god of wine. And there is a good deal of evidence for his cult taking place in Meroe. On the right is a raiton, a ritual vessel, made by a potter named Sotades, who is known, he was based in Athens in the 5th century BC. He is famous for these three-dimensional sculptural vessels. In this case, we have an Amazon riding on horseback. And this found its way thousands of miles to Meroe, and also hundreds of years between the time it was made and the time it was buried, because this was a 5th century BC object that was found in a 1st century BC context. We will probably never know exactly how it got there. It's possibly via the Persians, because the scene and the red figure at the top of the vase shows Persians defeating Greeks. So it might have been made for a Persian patron. And the last thing I want to show you is this, and these, what are they? This pile of bone, ivory, and bronze tubes were found in the entrance to the burial chamber of one of Nubia's most powerful ruling queens, Amani-Sheketo. And by the time they arrived at the MFA, they looked something like this, which I have to say, many years ago, I thought would never, ever be turned back into anything that would be able to be exhibited. But thanks to a 5-year effort by an international group of conservators, music historians, music makers, and music archaeologists, they have painstakingly been able to reconstruct these into a series of vessels known as auloi. And these are the principal vessels that we see played in the Mediterranean world at this time, many times in the cult of Dionysus specifically. And they vary in length from a little under a foot for the shortest pair to over 3 feet long on the biggest pairs. And they're double reed instruments. Classical translators often call them flutes, but our head of musical instruments, Darcy Coronin, hates that. He keeps reminding us not to use the F word, that they are in fact closer to oboes or bassoons in terms of their. And thanks to this group that's been working on them, we have been able to make, or they have been able to make reproductions that are playable. So for the first time, we actually know what these types of instruments sounded like. And with that, I am going to hand you off to Deb and questions.
Thank you so much, Denise. That was a terrific introduction. And I want to just make a note to our participants that if you're having any trouble accessing the chat box, you can use the question space to ask any questions that you have. So if you look in your control panel, there is a piece of it for questions. And if you type your question there, it will come through to us, and we can then convey it over to Denise. So I'm going to bring my screen back up in a minute, but for right now, what I'd like to do is pose some of the questions that have been posed along the way. Whoops, and here is actually a resource sheet of further resources that I want to share with you. But for right now, I want to focus on questions that Denise can assist us with. So we've had questions about language along the way, and you spoke about that briefly, Denise. But people are wondering whether Egyptians, from what we know of Nubian language, would Egyptians and Nubians have understood one another's spoken language? Is there any kind of understanding of that based on the sounds of the two?
It's not so much based on the sounds, but I think the elite, the people who are scribes and higher in the administration, could probably understand one another and speak each other's languages. Whether the everyday person could or not is unclear. But there are texts that mention people in Egypt uh, reading texts that are being carried by Nubians. The languages are not entirely the same language family, but and it's such a great mystery because we don't know what the native language, we can't translate it. And the fact that we have no text uh, from the Kerma period, and then we can't read the text from the Meroitic period, and these are end of things, it makes it very confusing. And then just in the Napatan period, when the official documents are written in Egyptian, it's as though someone has switched on a light. We finally know people's names, and we know how they want to be recognized and what their values were. So what we need really is a Rosetta Stone for Meroitic, where we have a text in Meroitic juxtaposed with the text in Egyptian or Greek or something uh, that will clear up.
Illuminate the whole thing. Are there known tombs in Nubia that haven't been excavated where something like a Rosetta Stone could in theory be placed?
Oh yes, absolutely. There is still a lot of excavation going on in Sudan today. A number of international teams, including working at all of these same sites. And new discoveries are being made almost on an annual basis that change what we know about Nubia. So it's perfectly possible that one could ultimately involve a text that is in multiple languages. But a lot of what Reisner got wrong, he couldn't really have been expected to get right because many of the kinds of sites that have been excavated since then, like we have found, not we personally, some scholars have found tombs from that period in between when the Egyptians left and the Napatan period took over Egypt that show this very closely entangled sort of hybrid Egyptian Nubian population living in the northern part of Sudan. So there's a lot more interconnection and exchange. And in Reisner's day, it was always viewed as a one-way influence from Egypt to Nubia. But now it's very clear that that was not the case at all, that there was exchange going back and forth all the time.
It's much more exciting to think about that than a one-way transmission. One of our participants wrote about the alabastron. What an object. What was the function of an alabastron? It looks like a perfect water bottle for a hipster.
Well, they were mostly used on a small scale for unguents and ointments and perfumes and so forth. I think this is interesting. Once they added that elaborate collar to it, I don't know that it could be used for anything because it'd be hard to pour out of without these beads hanging into whatever you are pouring. But these things come on all different scales. We have one in the collection that is so huge that in order to put it on view, we had to use, riggers. It weighs hundreds of pounds. So I think they were used for different things, but most of them are on a small scale, and they may well have been used for water. But they range a lot in size and must have been used to contain different types of objects depending on their size.
Okay, thank you. Having a little bit of trouble seeing this next question. I also want to invite people to raise their hand. That is another possibility for our attendees to say your question out loud. So if you're having any difficulties posting, in the attendee dashboard, there's a small hand icon that you're welcome to use, and please feel free to do that. Okay, let's see. Denise, another
Yes.
question that was raised had to do with teaching about daily life and the social strata well below the royalty. So in Egypt, we know a lot about that. How much do scholars know about the daily life of commoners in earlier or later Nubian civilizations? And if we don't know very much, what records are missing? What are some of the biggest mysteries or holes in the knowledge you wish you had about how people lived?
Well, I would think to some extent, even in Egypt, we tend to have a very uh, top-heavy record because the people who wrote were the 1% of the elite. In Nubia, one of the issues is that when early excavators like George Reisner worked in Nubia, they particularly went for temples and tombs. And the reason for that is that they wanted to, well, there's a couple of reasons. One is that they wanted to find good things for the museums. And people don't tend to leave good things behind in their towns unless they are unfortunate, like the people of Pompeii and are suddenly buried by a disaster. Uh, and so they went for the relatively low hanging fruit. The other thing about town sites is that they are harder to find because they're under modern villages. Sometimes they're under people's fields or their palm orchards. So it's really only been in the last 20 or 30 years that any sort of town sites are being excavated. So as that happens, we will probably get a much better idea of what daily life was really like. Because now basically what we have, particularly in a collection like ours, is only funerary and religious material belonging to the very, very wealthiest people. So what we will hopefully be seeing as excavations, it's become a big focus now of new excavations, to look for town sites and to look for more middle class cemeteries. And of course, excavators now have access to resources that Reisner couldn't even have dreamt of, like ground penetrating radar and satellite imagery. And using these, it's much easier to identify towns before having to excavate them. So if you you kind of know where you're going to find architecture. And what's really exciting is that the city of Napata, which has never been discovered, we have the temple at Jebel Barkal, we have the adjacent royal cemeteries, but a scholar from University of Michigan named Jeff Emberling has now thinks he has, using things like satellites and ground penetrating radar, identified the location of the settlement. And that will be really exciting when that is excavated because we will actually have the city of Napata and have probably royal palaces and workshops, but also residences of regular people, which will finally be excavated in a manner that is up to date. And then we'll probably be able to do all kinds of research on animal and plant remains that wasn't possible in Reisner's day, and really get more ideas about diet and nutrition and things like that.
We're looking forward to adding to our knowledge and filling out that context. I want to recognize a participant who has raised his hand, Greg Hazelwood. And Greg, I'm going to click on your microphone, which just unmuted you. So feel free to speak your question.
Oh, I actually wrote it down and just sent
Okay.
it. But I can read it?
Sure. Go for it. I see
Yeah.
it.
I just wrote down, what are some ways to begin the inquiry for students on who validate a civilization, how the narrative gets taught? For example, using Shankata Jop's work about ancient Africa. Also, how we can use the exhibit and artifacts so Nubia can be placed as a civilization worth studying in the curriculum.
That is actually one of the major objectives to doing this exhibition. And one of the things that we've done is we've brought in a number of outside voices, so giving perspectives on the ways that Nubia might still resonate with people, and on some of the reasons why Nubia has been left out of, particularly in the US, the history of art. And one of the reasons for that is that I think in the early part of the 20th century, particularly when these excavations were going on, there was a bias in favor of the quote unquote Western art. And there still is, that still lingers today. But for whatever reason, the people, scholars like Reisner and other Egyptologists tended to take Egypt out of Africa and put it into the Western canon and not Nubia. So Nubia sort of got left behind. And I think that the goal of doing an exhibition like this, and we are really pushing the idea of there's the sixth grade curriculum in the Massachusetts schools. They usually bring their sixth graders to come to the MFA's collections, and we're making sure to include the Nubian exhibition in their tours this year, and also providing them with free tickets to bring their families back in the hopes of sort of spreading the word that ancient Nubia is out there and deserving of its rightful place in the, I mean, to a certain extent, even Asian art that falls, I mean, we still have a very Eurocentric art history.
Thank you.
Curriculum here.
Thanks, Greg. Great question.
Thank you.
Could you speak a little bit, Denise, to gender history? The history you alluded to is fascinating. Beauty ideals, powerful queens. Is there more you can say about women's history in Nubian society?
Yes, I mean, for the early periods when we don't have writing, there's precious little that can be said. But in the Napatan period, when we do have royal monuments inscribed in a language that we can read, it seems that the queens, and particularly the royal mothers, played a big role in the succession. And it's not exactly clear how, but a number of kings who left coronation inscriptions describing their coronations always make a point of having their mother be there. And we also have a succession that doesn't go strictly linear from father to son to son to son to son. It seems that after the death of a certain king, all of his sons that were still alive would take turns after one another before going on to the next generation. And that's thought to have been possibly because they would exhaust all of the sons of the queen mother before going on to the next generation. Now, in Meroitic, we know for a fact that there are ruling queens who are not the wives of kings at all, but actually queens who sit on the throne on their own right. And they have elaborate tombs and temples that show them doing all the sorts of things that kings normally do, like bashing in the heads of poor enemies, and they're shown as very powerful, formidable figures. And it is kind of interesting that it's one of these queens who Augustus came up against in Nubia, and after a few years of warfare or battles at the border of Egypt and Nubia, ended up signing a treaty with one of these queens. And I get a kick out of that here's Augustus takes over most of the known world, but he can't get past the Nubian queen.
That's great. That's great. I had a question for you about the color blue and whether art historians or curators have theories of the significance of that blue. Looking at the landscape of Nubia and how arid it looks, it made me wonder about water or about the sky. And I'm just wondering if there's anything at all to go on and in what you think about it.
My guess would be the sky, because there's a lot of solar imagery. There's certainly all of these winged beings who are obviously intended to fly up to the heavens. And so the sky and water would be the two obvious choices. But because of the solar imagery of a lot of them, I think the sky might be logical. But
Uh-huh.
given how rare and valuable precious water was, I'm sure that obtaining water was probably a function of some of these religious, and even scenes of them pouring water. We would think, oh, big deal, they're pouring water as an offering. But for them, pouring water would be a big sacrifice.
Mhm. And one other question I had, and I may have missed this as you were talking about timelines, but did Egyptians um, originate the form of the pyramid, or did the Nubians do that? Sort of, I know they look very different in the two cultures, but I'm sort of curious where the model might have been set.
Well, when people think of Egyptian pyramids, they usually think of the fourth dynasty pyramids at Giza. And then when you look at Nubian pyramids, they seem much steeper and pointier. Uh, but Egyptians actually continued to build pyramids up until the time period in which Nubians were, Egypt was in charge of Nubia. And if you visit some of these later tombs of uh, Egyptian people in the Theban area, for example, their pyramids are much steeper and they have the same kind of uh, chapels attached to their base that the Nubians had, where they would set up a relief and an offering table for people to come and continue to worship them, or not worship them, but pray for their well-being in the afterlife. So I think the Nubians probably took their inspiration from some of these later Egyptian pyramids rather than from the big Fourth Dynasty ones. Although they were familiar with them because the kings were ruling part of the year from uh, Memphis, which is right near the Giza pyramids. But that doesn't seem to be what inspired them. So they predate, Egyptian pyramids predate Nubian pyramids by a couple of millennia. But the
Mhm.
other interesting thing, though, is that there are actually more pyramids in Nubia than there are in Egypt.
Oh, interesting. Huh. Why do you think that is?
Well, because the Egyptians' pyramids went out of fashion after a certain point in the New Kingdom, around 1600 or so BC, and they started having the rock cut tombs in the Valley of the Kings instead.
Ah,
Uh, and a lot of um, the earlier pyramids in Egypt are really not well preserved. I mean, the big stone ones are, but they later began using materials that are uh, they're basically mounds of sand with the stone exteriors. And the stone exteriors were taken away to build churches and mosques and various other things, which then just left this rubble mound which hasn't survived well. So
mhm.
once you get later on in Egyptian history, like say the later Old Kingdom or Middle Kingdom, a lot of the pyramids are barely recognizable as pyramids.
Thanks. And we just have time for maybe one or two more questions at most. So here is another. What are some of the ways to begin the inquiry for students on who validates a civilization? Actually, I think this may be the question that you already answered from Greg. Um, Actually, he asked that one already. So let me follow up that question with one from Susan. Are there 4 characteristics of the civilization you would want conveyed to young people, sort of the distinctive or characteristic features? What would top your list? And that's a great question to close out on.
One thing I think is, at least to me, really remarkable is the technical mastery they have. Given the very limited tools, ways to control heat, for example, that they were able to both come up with these exquisite designs and also execute them in such a sophisticated fashion technically. In many ways, I think their designs are more innovative and more experimental than the Egyptians. Uh, I think it would be important to convey the extent of those trading networks, which is something that, I mean, we think about the world today as being very interconnected and global economy. And while this is certainly not global on that scale, the extent to which their trading networks reached is something that current excavations have only just been revealing. And I think the economic power of a place like Nubia, which today seems like it's very remote geographically, but how really well connected it was in antiquity. And the way that they used their interconnectedness with their natural world too. Their use of resources and their mastery of taking advantage of their resources, I think, is a important thing to note. And I think also you can't really study Egyptians without Nubians and Nubians without Egyptians. The fact that there was a constant give and take, a sort of love-hate relationship where they would be friends and neighbors one day and active trading partners, and at another time, because of the competition for these resources, become rivals and even enemies. Then I think what tends to happen is, what used to happen consistently was that Nubia would just be subsumed as Egypt, as part of Egypt, like Egypt light. But now I think sometimes in our effort to distinguish the two cultures, we'll say Egypt is, I sometimes find myself wanting to make sure people realize that Nubia is something distinct from Egypt, that I almost make it too distinct, because there was this constant interaction. That there's not a hard and fast border where you have a wonderful wall and suddenly the Nubians and the Egyptians don't interact at all. Although I think those fortresses the Egyptians built were trying to achieve something like that.
Right, right. So the fluidity of borders and cultures, it seems like a great metaphor for so many ancient civilizations and their neighbors of whatever kind. These were two powerful civilizations, both remarkable in their own right. But keeping in mind, as a teaching point, I think that Egypt and Nubia go together in important respects. Even as we're catching up in our learning about one of them is a terrific and really vital insight to end our webinar on. I want to thank you, Denise, for making Nubia so much more vivid to us and encourage everyone to see the MFA exhibit. Denise has shared some wonderful highlights for you, and I think having a tour kind of with her and her extensive knowledge about each piece is such a treat. But there isn't anything like seeing these things with your own eyes. So if you can get there, do go and check out the Nubia exhibition that's at the MFA. Until when? What is the closing date, Denise?
It's up until January 20th. So you've got a couple of months.
And take friends over the holidays as well. Thank you so much, Denise, for spending this time with us and putting this collection of slides together. And I hope teachers will be able to use it and take it back to classrooms so that the next generation of students won't grow up asking, what is Nubia? They'll have a true insight to begin with.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you, Denise, and to everyone for attending, and please share the webinar with your colleagues. We really appreciate your taking time this afternoon. Take care all.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.